So welcome to Module 4 of our Essentials Pedagogy Toolkit, Assessment for and as Learning. Now, you may have heard of the expression assessment of learning, and I'm sure you have. This is when we're thinking about the type of kind of traditional assessment that we might do. Assessment of learning is often done by the teacher. It's to help the teacher figure out where the students are in their learning, so it might give them a percentage or a grade. And it's often done in a traditional way, like an examination or a test. So that assessment of learning is most often, I imagine, what we think about when we mention the word assessment. This module is not about assessment of learning. This module is looking at the other two sides of this triangle, assessment for learning and assessment as learning. So assessment for learning is often done by the teacher as well, but it could be done by a peer of a student. It could be done by a student's friend. And the purpose of assessment for learning is really looking at the next steps. So if we think about the difference between assessment of learning and assessment for learning, assessment of learning is feedback. It's saying, this is where you're at, this is your percentage on this piece of work, this is what was good about it. Assessment for learning is really next steps, and we might call that feed forward. So different to feedback, assessment of learning, we might consider assessment for learning as feed forward. And a really good example of that is critique, and we're going to look at a critique protocol shortly. In terms of assessment as learning, this is the type of assessment which is what often called self-assessment. It's done by the student, and the purpose is self-regulation. So the student is trying to reflect on how they're going themselves so that they can set learning goals that they can work towards. We're actually going to talk a lot more about that in the next module about learner agency. But it does exist as a really important type of assessment as well, where students are self-assessing and self-regulating, taking control of their learning. So in this module, we're going to cover learning intentions and success criteria, proxies for learning, and assessment for learning techniques. As ever, you can pause this video, you can rewind it, you can stop and take a break, or you can maybe take some notes, entirely up to you. But this is your learning, so please feel free to use it in any way that works out for you. So let's have a look at learning intentions and success criteria. So to clarify, learning intentions, we can really useful to write them in the first person plural, i.e. we are learning or something. So we are learning how human activity impacts climate change. So we're describing what learners should know, understand, or be able to do by the end of a learning experience. In terms of success criteria, there are lots of different ways to formulate what success would look like, but one way is to phrase the success criteria as I can because I have. So for example, I can give three compelling examples of human activity impacting climate change because I've created an infographic on the subject using research and data. So if we have really tight learning intentions and success criteria, which we did talk a lot more about in Module 1, it's a really powerful way for us to help students to see their own learning growth, to understand where they're going, how to get there, and what success will look like when they do get there. So in terms of assessment for learning, that means our students have actually got a goal. So we've got assessment of learning, we've got assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. If we've got really strong learning intentions, we can actually, and success criteria, we can actually get some data on all of those aspects of assessment. So I just want to talk briefly about proxies for learning. Now, we cannot see inside students' brains. So we can't actually see them learning. We can't see their synapses making connections. We can't see what's going on in their brains. So we have to design a proxy. So a proxy is a way of representing something that we can't see, or that it's something in the place of something else. So what we're talking about when we're talking about proxies for learning are what are the things that we can design that will demonstrate what students have learned, what they now understand, what they can now do, which they couldn't do before. So I'm just going to go through some really simple ones, but we sometimes forget, and in our toolkit we want variety. We want lots of different ways for students to demonstrate their learning, so we want lots of different proxies. A really simple one is a speaking presentation. Now, that might be a presentation to the class, and that is really great, but it might also be as simple as having a one-on-one conversation, or we might call it a learning conversation with a student, asking them a couple of questions, getting them to ask you a couple of questions. And it's actually a fantastic way to much more deeply understand a student's learning, individual learning, than it is to give an exam, for example. So what I would really recommend is that we're talking, we're having dialogue as much as possible. And sometimes we actually want to make those presentations to the whole class. That's awesome. Sometimes it might just be to a peer, or indeed just directly with the teacher. You might do something like an infographic. This is a really lovely way for students to use data and information, and also graphics, to take that complex data and present it in such a way as to make it simpler and easier to understand. So there are tons of great examples of infographics out there, but it really does give students the opportunity to synthesize, or to bring together lots of different information, connect it together, and then present it in a really lovely visual way. You might do something like a design challenge. So for those of you who participate in the Watch W design challenge, you know all about this. You might give students a real design problem. So you might be studying something like climate change, but you decide that rather than having an exam on climate change, you're actually going to give students a design challenge. So you're going to ask them to design something to reduce the impacts of climate change in their community. So we can use design thinking to help us to do that. You might have an exhibition of learning, and a lot of you have been involved in exhibitions of learning. And this idea of actually having a public exhibition of what you've learned, to show your learning, to show your thinking to a public audience who will come and have a look and also give you a little bit of feedback, is really powerful. And we also know that our students are really gifted at creating video presentations. So I'll just mute this one for a second. But we've got, Caravat National High School here did a wonderful clean water system project. And they created the video themselves using a combination of photographs and video and even subtitling. So giving students the opportunity to actually demonstrate their learning through something as powerful as video is a really wonderful way, a wonderful proxy for their learning. Okay, we're now going to go on to just a few assessment for and assessment as learning techniques. So you might want to take a quick break now and then come back in a moment if you want to have a little bit of a break or a reflect, but otherwise we're going to explore some of these tools. So let's think about goal setting and reflection. Really, really important for students. Your curriculum will dictate to a certain extent the kind of knowledge and understanding that students need to have, but each student is different. And if we allow our students to set goals and to reflect, then we're empowering them to have what we call agency over their learning. And what it allows them to do is this assessment as learning. So having some goals, reflecting and self-regulating about how they can improve. So you might not want to do a learning goal. A student might not have a learning goal for every single lesson, but maybe over a period of time, 3 or 4 weeks, they might have a specific goal that they want to work on in terms of their learning. And giving them the opportunity to construct those goals and then to reflect on them is a really powerful form of assessment as learning. What I want to do is just quickly mention this idea of retrieval practice, because it's a very useful kind of thing to think about. Is that one of the ways to help students get information from their brain, from their working memory, their short-term memory, into their long-term memory, which is we can call kind of deep learning, is to get them to use it again and again. So what I'm kind of saying is that in terms of assessment for learning, we will often have many tests and things like that, and then move on to a new module and never revisit that material until we get maybe to the exam or the end of the year or whatever. So what I'm going to suggest to you is that in terms of retrieval practice, it's actually really useful to help students to actually recap something that they've done maybe 3 weeks ago. So just thinking about dropping in some short tasks, which are about retrieval of information that they learned 3 or 4 weeks ago, but in a meaningful way, actually really embeds that information deeply within their long-term memory. So if you think back to Module 1 and the hook activities, it might well be that you put an activity in there which is a retrieval practice. So it's actually retrieving something from 3 or 4 weeks ago and using it and just reinforcing that within their long-term memory. So even though it feels like it's a little bit of a test, it actually has a much deeper purpose of moving that into that information into long-term memory. There are lots of different feedback strategies. We talk about critique, and when we're talking about giving really good critique, giving really good feedback to students, or assessment for learning, then we want to be, and we want our students, when they're assessing each other, to be kind, specific, and helpful. And what that means is that if they demonstrate something to us, they show us some work and they want some feedback or some critique, Then we're going to be kind. So we're going to be really respectful of the fact that this is their work and they have an emotional connection to it. So we're going to be kind but realistic. So we're not going to say that's wonderful just to make someone feel good. We are going to say, yeah, I really like this thing. That leads us on to the next part of this kind of protocol, which is we're going to be specific. So we're going to focus in on the small things in order to make the whole thing better. And finally, we're going to be helpful. So really giving what we might call feed forward, helping students to move forward. What are the next steps they can take? So if I were to write on a piece of work or to give some verbal feedback to a student which said, try harder, it's not particularly kind. It's definitely not specific. And in fact, it's not all that helpful. I don't know what you want me to try harder on. If you write something like good work, that's kind, but it's not specific, so I don't actually know what was good about the work, and therefore it's not helpful because I don't know what to repeat again later. So just getting into our brains and in the brains of our students, this kind of protocol around being kind, specific, and helpful is a really powerful form of assessment for and assessment as learning. Exit tickets are a classic kind of assessment for learning piece. What you might do is you might ask a question, and before students can, or as students are leaving the class, they might hand just on a little piece of paper to you an exit ticket with their answer to that and their name on it, which means that you're able to see everyone's understanding. So you get a kind of a little dip into the understanding of the class at the end of a lesson. And you need to use that. So if it comes back and actually there are lots of misunderstandings or miscomprehension, then next lesson you may need to reteach that concept differently. So it's actually a really powerful way, not only for assessment of learning to know where the kids are at, but assessment for learning to understand where each individual is and what they might need to get better. But also it's really useful for your own assessment as learning. So your own self-regulation and goal setting and reflection on your own practice. It's a really useful piece to think I can get this feedback from the students and change my teaching and adapt my teaching to meet their needs. We've got a really, really super simple one, but one of my favorites is thumbs up, thumbs middle, thumbs down. So it's a really great way to gauge just a level of confidence in the classroom. So you might just say to people, okay, I could confidently explain how photosynthesis works. Everyone put your hands up. If you can confidently do that, you're going to put your thumb up. If you're like, no, I'm not sure, I could explain it, but I'm not confident, then put your thumb in the middle. And then if you really couldn't do that, your thumb's going to go down. And what that allows you as a teacher to do is just to have a kind of a general feedback around how things are going, how well material is being understood by students. And that then gives you the opportunity to say, oh, okay, well, what I might do is I might get all of my thumbs up people who can confidently explain photosynthesis, just to work with my thumbs middle people who are not kind of super confident, just to work together to try and help them to get up to confidence. And then I might take all of those students who are feeling very not confident and do a little bit of reteaching. So it gives us that opportunity to actually reformulate and regroup students in our classroom and allow them to have assessment as learning, so have some self-regulation and goal setting, but it gives you a really powerful assessment for learning piece as well. The next strategy is pose, pause, pounce, bounce. So pose, pause, pounce, bounce is a really powerful strategy for you to understand the students. So it's an assessment for learning as well as an assessment of learning strategy. It helps you to understand where the students are at, but it also helps students to really stay on track and stay focused in class, because what we're going to do is often when we ask questions, students will put their hands up, and often the same students will put their hands up, and research shows that often teachers will choose the same students. With pose, pause, pounce, bounce, we say no hands up in the classroom. So I'm going to ask some questions, but you're not allowed to put your hand up. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to use this pose, pause, pounce, bounce strategy, and I'm going to pose the question. So I'm going to ask a question. So it might be, can you explain to me the process of photosynthesis in 30 seconds? What I'm then going to do is pause. And this is really important because there's lots of research, especially some research in the UK, about how quickly we expect students to answer. So on average, on some of the research, on average, teachers were asking a question and they were getting an answer within 2.1 seconds. So that's very, very quick, which either means the students already know the answer to the question, so maybe it's not a question worth asking, or you're just getting one or two people who are answering who already know this and everyone else is just sitting back. So what pausing does is it allows everybody the opportunity to think, because you've asked the question, you've posed the question, you're now pausing a significant amount of time, maybe even a minute. And then you're going to pounce. So you as the teacher, you're going to choose someone and you're going to call them out and say, okay, John, you're going to answer this. So then John answers the question, and they've had enough time to think about it, so now they answer the question. But the next bit is that actually what you're going to do is bounce. What that means is John is then going to bounce his answer to Mehdi, and Mehdi is going to say, okay, actually, I really, really like that answer. However, I would have added this thing to it. Or indeed, I'm not sure if that's right. This is what I think. I'm not sure. And you can bounce it again and again and again in class. So if you imagine, rather than having ping pong, which is the teacher and the student, or ping pong or table tennis, the teacher, student, teacher, student, teacher, student, teacher, student, it's more like basketball. So the question goes out from the teacher, goes to a student, it's then passed to another student, it's then passed to another student, then passed to another student. And then eventually the teacher can correct any miscomprehensions that are still in there. So a really powerful strategy. So the challenge is to choose one of the assessment techniques covered in this module, trial it in class, and ask for feedback from your students. Then share your technique with colleagues and encourage them to give it a go. Your reflection for this one is going to use one of those assessment for learning techniques, but we're just going to do it in a written form. And what I want you to do is to use on Module 4's reflection confidence scale in your workbook and say, just go through and circle the correct thumb. So I can explain the difference between assessment of learning and assessment for learning. If you're confident you can, then you're going to circle the green thumb. If you're not sure, you're going to circle the yellow thumb. And if you're definitely not, you have no idea, you're going to circle the red thumb. Go through these questions, circle the thumbs, and then come back. And your feed forward is, well, what are you going to work on with your students and what are your next steps? But obviously, if you don't understand the difference between assessment of learning and assessment for learning, you can either come back through this video, go back through your workbook, ask someone else, making sure that you don't leave this module until you do have a confident grasp of all of the material within it.